His wife became a lawyer and celebrated by filing for divorce the same day. Not the next morning, not after a conversation. The same day, before the ink on her bar results was dry, before she had made a single phone call, before she had done anything else with her brand new license, except use it to end a marriage. She walked out of that courthouse, sat down at a restaurant table, surrounded by colleagues, announced it like a punchline, and let another man refill her glass while her husband was still legally sitting across town, wondering why she hadn't come home yet. And her husband, a quiet man, a patient man, a man who had paid every bill and driven her to every exam and eaten alone more nights than he could count, found out from his cousin at the barber shop. What she didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, what nobody would know for 3 more years, was that the man she just discarded had been quietly holding the foundation of her entire career in place, not with money, not with connections, with something far more dangerous: his silence. And the day she filed those papers was the day he decided the silence was over. Here's the question you need to sit with. What happens when the man everyone underestimated turns out to be the only reason the people who humiliated him still had anything left to lose? If that question just made you lean forward, hit the like button right now, because this story only gets more satisfying from here. Subscribe if you're new so you don't miss what's coming. And drop your city in the comments. We want to know where in the world you're watching from today. The comment section is already moving and we want to see your city up there. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started. To a Thursday morning in October in Memphis, Tennessee, when a woman walked into a courthouse and made the most expensive mistake of her life without spending a single dollar. It was a Thursday morning in October, and Dominique Bowman walked into the Shelby County Courthouse the way she walked into every room she had decided belonged to her, chin up, heels sharp against the floor, the particular energy of a woman who had been waiting a long time to arrive somewhere. She had passed the Tennessee bar exam on her second attempt. The results came through on her phone at 7:43 in the morning. By 9 o'clock, she was standing at a filing window with a manila envelope she had prepared 3 days earlier, sliding it across the counter with the steady hands of a woman who had already made her decision and was simply completing the paperwork. The divorce filing was her first solo legal act as a licensed attorney in the state of Tennessee. She was at the Capitol Grill on Union Avenue by noon. The table was already full when she arrived, colleagues from Caldwell and Price, 2 paralegals, a woman from the firm's administrative office who had brought a card signed by everyone on the floor. The kind of lunch that gets planned in group texts over several days, full of exclamation points and restaurant suggestions, and someone asking 3 times whether the reservation was confirmed. Dominique sat at the head of the table like she had earned the seat, because in her mind she had. The champagne came, the toast started, and somewhere between the second glass and the appetizers, Dominique set down her flute and told the table that she had filed for divorce that morning. There was a half-second of silence, the kind that happens when a room recalibrates. And then people laughed. Someone said, "Good for you." Someone else said she deserved a fresh start. Derek Caldwell Jr., sitting 2 chairs to her left, reached over and refilled her glass without being asked. Dominique smiled the smile of a woman who had just taken off a coat she had been wearing too long. Nobody at that table said Terrence's name. Terrence Bowman found out at 4 in the afternoon. He was at his desk on Summer Avenue finishing a reconciliation report for one of his commercial clients when his phone rang. It was his cousin Damon. Damon said he had heard something at the barbershop on Chelsea Avenue from a man who knew someone who had been at the restaurant. Damon said he was sorry to be the one to call. Damon asked if Terrence was all right. Terrence told him he was fine. He sat at his desk for another 20 minutes after that, staring at the reconciliation report without reading it. The numbers on the page meant nothing. Then he locked up the office, walked to his car, and drove home through the kind of late-afternoon Memphis traffic that gives a man too much time to think. He did not turn on the radio. He pulled into the driveway of the house on Kimbrough Avenue, the house he had made every mortgage payment on for 7 years, and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The kitchen was quiet. The light through the window was the flat, grey kind that comes in October when the sun starts leaving earlier than you're ready for. Terence sat down at the kitchen table without turning on any lights. He did not make a phone call. He did not eat anything. He just sat there in the grey light, still as furniture, the way a man sits when he is not grieving yet but can feel it waiting for him just around the corner. He sat there for a long time. Then he pushed back his chair, walked down the hall to his home office, and moved the small bookshelf beside his desk 3 inches to the left. Beneath the bookshelf was a false panel cut into the hardwood floor, fitted so cleanly that you would never find it unless you knew where to press. Terence pressed it. The panel lifted. He reached in and retrieved a black fireproof lockbox, the kind sold at hardware stores to protect documents from house fires, the kind nobody thinks twice about. He set it on the desk. He opened it. And then he read through the contents the way a man reads something he already knows by heart, but needs to see with his own eyes one more time. Slowly, page by page, every figure and every date, every shell company name and every account number, every signature that was not his. He read it the way a man takes inventory of something he has been storing for a long time and is finally ready to use. When he finished, he closed the lockbox. He went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. Dark roast, the kind his father used to make on Sunday mornings, the smell of it filling the house the way it had when Terence was a boy. He stood at the counter and waited for it to brew. He poured a cup. He drank half of it standing up. Then he picked up his phone and called Calvin Marsh. Calvin answered on the second ring. Terence did not say hello. He did not explain what had happened, or describe what he was feeling, or ask for a moment to collect himself. He said 2 words in the same steady voice he used for everything. Client meetings, difficult conversations, 9 years of dinners eaten alone, while his wife studied for a degree he was paying for. He said, "Calvin, it's time." And the machinery that Terence Bowman had been quietly building for 4 years began at last to move. But to understand what was in that lockbox, and why those 2 words carried the weight they did, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when Terence and Dominique Bowman were just 2 people starting out before the firm and the title and the champagne lunches, back to when she was grateful and he was enough. Terence Bowman met Dominique Haynes at a church fish fry on a Saturday afternoon in late September, 9.5 years before any of this happened. She was sitting at a folding table with a paper plate of catfish and coleslaw, reading a contract law textbook with a highlighter in her hand, and he thought that was the most interesting thing he had ever seen a person do at a fish fry. He brought her a sweet tea she hadn't asked for. She looked up, looked at him, and said thank you in a way that meant she was going back to her book. He sat down anyway. They talked for 3 hours. She was a paralegal then, sharp, hungry, full of plans she listed out loud like she was reading from a document she had already written. He listened to all of them. He believed everyone. They married 14 months later. Terence had just opened Bowman Financial Services with $12,000 in savings and a second-hand desk he bought from an office liquidation sale on Lamar Avenue. The desk wobbled on one leg. He fixed it with a folded piece of cardboard from a cereal box and never thought about it again. That was the kind of man he was. Practical, unbothered, focused on what was in front of him. The early years were lean but steady. Terence took every client he could find, small business owners, sole proprietors, a woman who ran a daycare out of her home in Whitehaven, a man who owned 3 barber chairs and needed someone to handle his quarterly filings. He charged reasonable rates. He was meticulous. Word moved through the community the way good word always moves. Slowly at first, then all at once. Dominique enrolled at the University of Memphis the year after they married. Terence paid the tuition. He paid the mortgage on the house on Kimbrough Avenue. He paid the utilities, the groceries, the car note on her Civic. He did this without announcement or complaint, the way a man does things when he has decided they are simply what needs to be done. She finished her undergraduate degree in 3 years. She enrolled at Cecil C. Humphreys School of Law the following fall, attending night classes while working part-time as a paralegal during the day. Terence started eating dinner alone most evenings. He didn't mind. He'd heat up whatever was in the refrigerator, sit at the kitchen table with a client file and work until she got home. Those were still good years. The change was gradual enough that it was hard to name while it was happening. Dominique graduated from law school and landed the provisional position at Caldwell & Price, and something in her posture shifted. The way she held herself at family gatherings, the way she described her work to people, the particular careful distance she began to put between herself and anything she considered ordinary. Terence noticed it. He told himself it was ambition. He told himself it would settle. Rochelle noticed it too, and she fed it. Dominique's mother had always carried herself like a woman who believed her family deserved better than what they had. She ran her catering business with real skill. The woman could produce a spread for 200 people and make it look effortless. But her social ambitions ran considerably ahead of her income. She measured people by their titles. She measured her daughter's life by the life she thought her daughter ought to have. And the more Dominique's world expanded, the more clearly Rochelle saw Terence as an obstacle to the version of her daughter's future she had been curating in her mind for years. She never called him by his name at family gatherings. It was always the bookkeeper, said the way you might say the plumber, or the man who came about the gutters. Functional, temporary, easily replaced. Terence heard it every time. He said nothing every time. He passed the potato salad and answered direct questions and drove home with Dominique in a car that felt colder than the weather outside. The first time he heard Dominique use the word herself, they were at the firm's holiday party, the 2nd December, after she joined Caldwell & Price. He had stepped away from the table to get a drink and came back to find Dominique mid-sentence, her back half-turned, a glass of red wine in her hand. She was talking to a woman from the firm's litigation department about their respective husbands. Terence heard the words, "My husband has a little tax office," and then dropped lightly, almost affectionately, the way people say things they don't realize are cruel. "It's just a little shack on Summer Avenue, honestly." The woman laughed. Dominique smiled. Terence picked up his drink and walked back to the table. He sat down. He did not bring it up in the car. He did not bring it up that night or the next morning or ever. He filed it away in the same place he filed everything that he was not yet ready to do anything about. By then, his client base had grown to 11 businesses. 3 of them, acquired through separate referrals over 2 years, no single introduction connecting them, belonged to the senior partners of Caldwell & Price. Gerald Caldwell Sr. came to him through a mutual contact in the business community. Raymond Osei came through a referral from a church deacon who knew Terence's father. Linda Whitmore came through Gerald's personal recommendation, which she received and acted on without ever mentioning it to anyone at the firm. Nobody connected the names. Why would they? To anyone looking, Terence Bowman was just a bookkeeper with a wobble-legged desk and a modest office on Summer Avenue. The first year he prepared Gerald Caldwell Sr.'s personal and business returns, everything looked straightforward. The second year, Terence noticed a figure in one of the subsidiary accounts that didn't quite match the corresponding income declaration. It was small, easily explainable as a rounding error or a misclassified expense. He noted it. He moved on, but it was not a rounding error. It was not a mistake at all. 3 days after Dominique filed those papers, Terence Bowman drove down Poplar Avenue on a Sunday morning with the lockbox on the passenger seat beside him, riding the way a passenger rides. Still, settled, as if it had always been headed somewhere, and was simply waiting for the right destination. Calvin Marsh had his office on the second floor of a converted building between a dental practice and an insurance agency, the kind of block where serious work got done quietly, without fanfare. Terence had known Calvin since they were both 14 years old, cutting through the same shortcut behind the gymnasium at Melrose High to avoid being late to third period. 30 years of friendship, and Calvin still talked the same way he always had. Measured, precise, the kind of man who finished his sentences completely before starting the next one. Terence set the lockbox on the conference table without preamble. Calvin looked at it, then he looked at Terence, then he opened it. What happened next was 40 minutes of near silence. Calvin read through every document with the focused stillness of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and needed to be sure before he said a single word about it. He turned pages, he went back to earlier pages, he made small marks on a legal pad in his own shorthand. He did not ask questions, he did not look up. He simply read with the kind of concentration that fills a room the way weather fills it. Quietly, completely, impossible to ignore. When he finally set the last page down, he did not speak immediately. He took off his reading glasses. He set them on the table. He looked at Terence for a long moment. Then he said, "Terence, do you understand what you're holding?" Terence said he thought he did. Calvin told him he needed to be sure because what he was about to explain changed everything. He started with the basics. As the tax preparer of record for all three senior partners at Caldwell and Price, Gerald Caldwell Sr., Raymond O.C., and Linda Whitmore, Terence held a specific legal status. He was not a bystander who had stumbled across something inconvenient. He was a licensed CPA with statutory knowledge of fraudulent filings he had personally reviewed and prepared. That distinction mattered enormously under federal law. It meant Terence did not simply have the option to report. In Calvin's professional judgment, he had an obligation, but the obligation was not the important part. The important part, Calvin said, and here he leaned forward slightly, was that Terence was the only person on the planet with first-hand documentary knowledge and preparer of record status across all three partners' accounts at the same time. Not one account, not two, all three simultaneously. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that made federal investigators sit up straight. Under the IRS whistleblower program, Calvin explained, a cooperating witness with documented evidence of tax fraud was entitled to between 15 and 30% of any proceeds collected from the resulting enforcement action. He wrote the numbers on the legal pad and turned it so Terence could see. $2.3 million in documented fraudulent activity. At 15%, that was $345,000. At 30%, it was $690,000. Terence looked at the numbers. He did not react to them the way a man reacts to unexpected good news. He looked at them the way he looked at everything, steadily, the way a builder looks at a set of plans. Calvin tapped his pen on the legal pad twice. There was one more thing, the most important thing. As the designated primary cooperating witness, Terence retained the legal right to withdraw or modify the scope of his cooperation at any point before final federal adjudication, provided he had not committed perjury. This was not a technicality. This was a structural feature of the whistleblower framework, and it meant something specific and consequential in this particular situation. Dominique's name appeared on 11 internal billing authorization documents from Caldwell and Price. She had signed them as a provisional associate over the course of 14 months. Calvin was careful here. He did not say she was guilty. He said she had signed. And under Tennessee bar rules, signing those documents was sufficient grounds for a disciplinary proceeding that could result in suspension or permanent disbarment, unless the primary cooperating witness formally limited the scope of his disclosure to exclude her personal involvement. Only Terence could do that. No attorney she hired could negotiate it. No partner at the firm could trade for it. No filing, no motion, no legal strategy available to Dominique Bowman could change the single fundamental fact that the only person capable of protecting her license was the man she had divorced 3 days ago. The irony of it settled into the room like something physical. Dominique had filed those papers to leave a man she believed had nothing. And in doing so, she had placed the entire trajectory of her legal career, the degree she had spent 6 years earning, the license she had used that same morning to file for divorce, directly into his hands. She had climbed a ladder she never once looked down to examine. Calvin set his pen down. He looked at Terence across the conference table and asked him a simple, direct question. "What do you want to do?" Terence did not hesitate. He did not look at the ceiling or out the window or down at his hands. He looked at Calvin and said exactly what he had decided the moment he opened that lockbox 3 nights ago in his home office, alone in the dark. "File everything," he said. "Don't limit Dominique's documents, not yet." Calvin held his gaze for 1 beat. Then he nodded once, reached for his phone, and began to dial. Calvin picked up the phone on a Sunday. The filings went out on a Wednesday. That was how Terence Bowman operated, not in a fury, not in the desperate, sloppy way of a man reacting to pain. He gave himself the weekend to be certain, not of what he was going to do because he had been certain of that since the moment he opened the lockbox, but of why he was doing it and what kind of man he intended to be on the other side of it. By Monday morning he was certain. By Tuesday, Calvin had the paperwork prepared. By Wednesday it was done. The strategy was precise and it was deliberate, and it had exactly one moving part that mattered. Calvin filed the whistleblower disclosure with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the formal complaint with the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility at the same time, through separate channels, on the same Wednesday morning. Not one before the other, both at once. The simultaneity was intentional. It meant neither agency would learn of the other's involvement through back channels before the filings were already on record. It meant the net dropped all at once, with no warning, with no gap for anyone to step through. The documentation Terence had assembled was comprehensive in a way that left no room for interpretation. Printed records, cross-referenced against digital copies, stored on an encrypted drive that Calvin would hold in his office safe. Every shell company transaction, every overbilled trust account entry, every return Terence had prepared or reviewed over 4 years of working as the back-office accountant for Gerald Caldwell Sr., Raymond Osei, and Linda Whitmore. $2.3 million in documented fraud, time-stamped, organized, airtight. The IRS whistleblower filing confirmed Terence's designation as the primary cooperating witness. Calvin called him that afternoon with the confirmation number. The estimated recovery range, if the enforcement action proceeded to collection, was between $345,000 and $690,000. Calvin said this carefully, in his measured way, like a man delivering information he wanted to make sure landed correctly. Terence said he understood. He asked Calvin to proceed with the next step. The next step was this. Terence's name would be protected in the initial filing stages, disclosed only to the relevant federal investigators under statutory confidentiality provisions. His identity as the cooperating witness would surface eventually. These things always did, but not yet. Not until the investigation had enough momentum to sustain itself without him having to be visible. That was how Terence wanted it. Quietly, completely, and without a single unnecessary word. There was one instruction Terence gave Calvin that Calvin wrote down and circled on his legal pad. Do not limit the scope of Dominique's documents. Leave that piece exactly where it is. Calvin wrote it down. He did not ask why. He had known Terence Bowman for 30 years, and he understood that when Terence said something once in that particular tone, it had been considered from every angle before it left his mouth. Calvin circled it and set his pen down, and that was the end of the conversation. Terence drove back to Summer Avenue. He unlocked the office. He made a pot of coffee. The same dark roast he made every morning, measured out the same way, brewed the same way, poured into the same white ceramic mug with the chip on the handle that he had never gotten around to replacing. He opened his appointment book. His 10 o'clock client was a woman named Brenda who ran a daycare out of her house in Whitehaven, 3 classrooms worth of toddlers, and a federal subsidy program that required quarterly estimated tax filings she never quite understood on her own. Brenda arrived at 10 sharp with a folder of receipts held together by a rubber band and a to-go cup of coffee she had brought him from the gas station on the corner because she always did. Terence thanked her for it. He sat across from her at his desk and walked her through the quarterly numbers the same way he always did, patiently, plainly, making sure she understood each line before they moved to the next one. When she left 40 minutes later, she thanked him twice and said she didn't know what she'd do without him. Terence told her she was doing fine. He had 4 more clients that afternoon. A man who owned a food truck. A woman who ran a hair supply wholesaler out of a warehouse in Fraser. A retired postal worker navigating his first year of self-employment income. A young man who had started a lawn care business with his brother and needed help setting up his books from scratch. Terence gave each of them exactly the same thing he always gave his clients: his full attention, his expertise, and the particular quality of patience that made complicated things feel manageable in his presence. He did not think about Caldwell and Price. He did not think about the filings or the IRS or the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility or the figure of $690,000 that Calvin had said carefully over the phone that afternoon. He worked. That was what he did. That was what he had always done. At 6:15, he locked the office door and turned off the lights and stood for a moment at his desk in the dark. The lockbox sat empty in the bottom drawer, lighter now than it had been in years. Its contents were finally where they were always meant to go. Not in a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard, not in the custody of a man who was hoping he would never need to use them. Out in the world. Moving. Across town, Gerald Caldwell Sr. did not yet know that his phone was about to ring. He did not yet know that a quiet man on Summer Avenue had just changed everything. He was sitting in his corner office behind a desk that cost more than most people's cars, completely and utterly certain that his world was exactly the size and shape he had always believed it to be. He was wrong. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning in week 2. Gerald Caldwell Sr. was at his desk when his assistant brought in the envelope. It carried the IRS Criminal Investigation Division's return address. He opened it himself, which he almost never did. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he picked up his phone and called a criminal defense attorney before he called anyone else in the building. Not his managing partner, not his son, not his personal accountant. Within 48 hours, the firm had quietly stopped accepting new client intake. No announcement, no explanation. Oh, the receptionist was simply told to take messages. Word moved through Memphis's legal community the way water moves, finding every crack, every gap, every low point. Within a week, people who had nothing to do with Caldwell and Price were talking about it over lunch on Main Street and in courthouse hallways and in the parking lots of continuing education seminars. Nobody knew the details yet. But people knew something. Week 3 arrived fast. Dominique was called into Gerald Caldwell Sr.'s office on a Wednesday morning. She sat down across from a man she had spent 14 months trying to impress, and he told her, in the flat, careful voice of someone who had already spoken to his attorney, that her name had appeared in the investigation's preliminary document review. He told her she was being placed on paid administrative leave, effective immediately, pending inquiry by the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility. She walked out of that building carrying a banker's box. She walked through the lobby past the receptionist who had signed her in every morning for 14 months. She walked to the elevator. She walked across the parking lot to her car. She loaded the box into the trunk. Derek Caldwell Jr. did not walk her out. His father had already told him not to. And Derek, who had refilled her champagne glass at the Capitol Grill while her husband was still legally sitting across town, did exactly what his father told him. He stayed at his desk. He did not look out the window. Week 4. Rochelle's Elegant Events lost 3 contracted corporate events in 8 days. The phone calls came in quick succession. Politely worded cancellations, each one citing scheduling conflicts that Rochelle recognized immediately as something else entirely. The partners at Caldwell and Price had spent years feeding her business through referrals, through recommendations at dinner parties, through the quiet social infrastructure that kept East Memphis's professional community connected. That infrastructure was now cutting her loose like dead weight. Rochelle called Dominique on a Thursday afternoon, and she was not calm about it. She wanted answers. She wanted explanations. She wanted to know what Dominique had done and why and how it had come to this. Dominique had no answers. She had nothing to offer her mother but silence and the particular exhaustion of a woman whose world had collapsed faster than she could track. Rochelle called back twice more that week. The conversations were shorter each time. Week 6. A certified letter arrived at the house on Kimbrough Avenue, addressed to Dominique Bowman. It was from the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility. Terence signed for it. He set it on the kitchen counter. He called Calvin. Calvin called the board and confirmed formal receipt on Dominique's behalf. That was the extent of it. Terence left the letter on the counter and went to work. Week 8. The Memphis Business Quarterly ran a brief item, 4 paragraphs buried on page 9, noting that Caldwell and Price was under federal investigation, that the firm had halted new client intake, and that 3 named senior partners had retained separate legal representation. It did not name Dominique. It named Gerald Caldwell Sr. It named Raymond Osey. It named Linda Whitmore. Rochelle's church read it on Sunday morning. She was standing in the fellowship hall after service, a paper plate of pound cake in one hand and a cup of punch in the other, when the first woman came up to her. Then the second, then the third. 3 women in sequence, asking the same careful question wrapped in different words. Rochelle said it was a misunderstanding. She said it the first time with full confidence, the second time with slightly less, the third time with the thin, papery conviction of a woman who knows she is not being believed and cannot stop talking. The fourth time, nobody had even asked. She just said it again into the air because she couldn't bear the silence. Nobody believed her after the third. Week 10. Derek Caldwell Jr. retained his own criminal defense attorney, separate from his father's, separate from the firm's. The Caldwell family, which had spent 22 years as one of Memphis's most prominent legal dynasties, whose patriarch's name was on the building's front door, was now represented by 3 different attorneys who were legally prohibited from sharing information with each other. 22 years. Gone in 10 weeks. Terence read the business journal item at his desk on Summer Avenue. He read it the same way he read everything, completely, without rushing, taking in each line. When he finished, he set it down on the corner of his desk. He picked up the next client file. He opened it to the first page. He went back to work. 3 years passed the way 3 years pass when a man has made his peace with something, steadily, without drama, one day at a time. Terence's business grew. He moved to a larger office in the same strip mall. He hired a part-time assistant. He was, by every measure available to anyone watching him, a man who had moved on. Then one morning, Calvin called. Calvin called on a Tuesday morning, just after 9. Terence was at his desk reviewing a year-end reconciliation for a restaurant owner in Midtown when his phone rang. Calvin's voice was measured, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it, a careful quality, like a man handling something fragile. He told Terence that Dominique Bowman had contacted his office directly, not through a mediator, not through her own attorney. She had called Calvin's personal office line herself and asked quietly if Terence would be willing to see her. Terence was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that isn't hesitation. Then he said, "Tell her Thursday, my office, 10 o'clock. He went back to the reconciliation. He finished it. He moved on to the next file. Thursday arrived the way Thursdays do in October in Memphis. Grey light, a chill that hadn't yet committed to the season, the smell of something turning in the air. Terence was at his desk by 8:30. He made coffee. He answered 2 emails. He did not rearrange anything on his desk, or straighten his chair, or do any of the small, performative things a man does when he is nervous. He was not nervous. He had been waiting for this meeting for 3 years, and now that it was here, he felt nothing except the steady, settled clarity of a man who has already decided everything that needs deciding. Dominique arrived at 9:53, 7 minutes early. She was wearing a grey blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She looked like a lawyer. She had worked very hard to look like a lawyer. Terence noticed the portfolio immediately, noticed the way she carried it like a prop, like something that was supposed to remind both of them of who she had become. She sat down across from him at the desk. She opened her mouth and began to speak, and for the first 90 seconds she was composed. She told him she needed him to limit the scope of his cooperation with the board. She told him her career was over if the disciplinary inquiry proceeded without his intervention. She told him she hadn't known about the fraud. And here her voice shifted, just slightly, like a floorboard that gives a fraction under weight. She told him the signatures were routine, that she had signed what she was told to sign, that she was 20 months into her legal career and she had trusted the people above her, and that trust had cost her everything. And then the composure cracked, not dramatically, not in a single moment. It went the way composure always goes when it has been held too long, in stages, the way a wall absorbs water before it gives, the way a voice gets quiet right before it breaks. By the time she finished speaking, her hands were pressed flat on the portfolio in her lap, and her eyes were bright with the specific shame of a woman who has come to ask for something from a person she once believed had nothing to give her. Terence let her finish completely. He did not interrupt. He did not lean forward. He did not soften his expression or harden it. He sat exactly the way he always sat. Still, hands flat on the desk, the way a man sits when the room belongs to him and always has. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he began. "I remember the night you didn't pass the first time," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. "You cried in the car for 40 minutes. I didn't say a word. I just drove. And when you were ready, I took you home and made you something to eat and told you that you were going to pass the next time. And I believed that. I genuinely believed that." He paused. "I was at my desk 3 years ago when Damon called me. He heard it at the barber shop on Chelsea Avenue. My own cousin had to tell me. And I sat in this office you called the shack, Dominique. I heard you say it twice at your firm's Christmas party. And I said nothing both times. And I thought about that night in the car. And I thought about every bill I paid, every exam I drove you to, every night I ate dinner alone because you were studying for a life you were going to build without me. And then I thought about this desk." He reached down and opened the bottom drawer. He set the fireproof lockbox on the desk between them. Dominique stared at it. The leather portfolio did not move. "I've had this for 4 years, Terence said. "Every filing, every account, every shell company and every overbilled trust account and every document with your signature on it. 4 years I sat here and said nothing, not because I was afraid, Not because I didn't know what I had, because I was your husband and I believed that meant something. He looked at her directly. He did not look away. You became a lawyer and celebrated by filing divorce papers on the same day. You let your mother call me the bookkeeper for 9 years. You let Derek Caldwell refill your glass while I was still legally your husband. And what you didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that I had been holding the roof over your entire career in place with my silence for 4 years. I wasn't the man you left behind. I was the reason you had somewhere to go. The room was completely quiet. Dominique's mouth had parted slightly. Her hands had gone still on the portfolio, with the grip of someone holding on to the only solid thing available. Terence closed the lockbox. Calvin is sending you a document this afternoon. I'm limiting the scope of my cooperation to exclude your personal filings. Your bar inquiry will be resolved. Your license will be reinstated. He stood up from the desk. Not because you deserve it from me, but because you didn't design what they built, and I am not going to let my anger make me into something I'm not. He picked up the lockbox. He walked to the door. Don't come back here, Dominique. He left. She remained in the chair for a long time after the door closed. The leather portfolio still in her lap. Still closed. She had prepared things to say, and none of them had been necessary, and none of them would have changed anything. The man she had spent 9 years overlooking had just shown her, with perfect precision and without raising his voice once, exactly what she had thrown away, and exactly what it had cost her. Here is what happened to everyone. Gerald Caldwell Sr. entered a guilty plea in federal court 18 months after Terence made that Wednesday morning phone call to Calvin. 2 counts of federal tax fraud, 1 count of wire fraud. The judge sentenced him to 26 months in a federal correctional facility and imposed a financial penalty that wiped out a significant portion of what the shell companies had been built to protect. The Tennessee Supreme Court disbarred him the following month. The name on the building came down before the year was out. Raymond Osei negotiated a cooperation agreement, 3 years probation, a $480,000 fine payable to the federal government. He kept his freedom and lost almost everything else, his reputation, his partnership stake, and whatever remained of the social standing he had spent 2 decades building inside Memphis's professional community. Linda Whitmore surrendered her license voluntarily before the disciplinary board could convene a formal hearing. She did not contest anything, she did not give interviews, she simply stopped being an attorney and disappeared from the public record as quietly as she had once helped design the fraud that put her name on it. Caldwell and Price dissolved within 4 months of the guilty plea, 22 years gone. Derek Caldwell Jr. left Memphis entirely. He cooperated with federal investigators against his own father in exchange for a reduced exposure agreement, and the Memphis community made sure he understood exactly how they felt about that for the better part of a year. The barbershops had opinions, the church fellowship halls had opinions, the parking lots outside Sunday services had opinions. By the time the conversation finally died down, Derek was already in Houston, starting over in a city that didn't know his father's name. Rochelle's Elegant Events filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 14 months after the investigation became public. The corporate referral network that had sustained her business for years had dissolved along with the firm that fed it. She sold the catering van, a white Mercedes Sprinter she had been deeply proud of, the kind of vehicle she had once pointed to as evidence of her success, and moved into her sister's house in Cordova. She did not call it a setback, she called it temporary. Whether she believed that was her own business. Dominique Bowman's license was reinstated exactly as Terence had promised. The scope limitation Calvin filed on her behalf narrowed the board's inquiry to the point of resolution. She took a position at a small plaintiff's firm in Nashville, 3 attorneys, modest offices, workers' compensation cases and slip-and-fall claims, and the slow, unglamorous work of representing people who had been hurt and needed someone in their corner. She was good at it. Her colleagues found her thorough, dependable, and unusually quiet for someone who had once carried herself the way she used to. She did not talk about Memphis. She did not talk about Caldwell and Price. She did not call anyone the bookkeeper. Terence received the IRS whistleblower recovery payment 19 months after Calvin filed the original disclosure. The check was for $412,000. He deposited $40,000 into Bowman Financial Services operating account. He thought about the second-hand desk with the wobbling leg he had bought at an office liquidation sale 14 years earlier. He thought about the $12,000 he had started with. He thought about his father, Earl Bowman, who had worked 31 years as a machinist and never once complained about the work because the work was how you took care of the people you loved. The remaining $372,000 became the seed funding for the Earl Bowman Financial Literacy Initiative. The initiative operated out of 3 community centers, one in Fraser, one in Orange Mound, one in Whitehaven, free tax preparation services, bookkeeping training for small business owners, financial education workshops for anyone who showed up on a Saturday morning and wanted to understand their own numbers. In its first year, the initiative assisted 340 households and helped launch 17 small businesses. In its second year, those numbers doubled. On a Saturday morning in October, exactly 2 years after a woman had walked into a courthouse and filed papers as her first solo legal act, Terence Bowman stood at a whiteboard in the Orange Mound Community Center and explained quarterly estimated taxes to 12 people who were listening the way people listen when they understand that what they are being taught is going to change something real about their lives. There was a woman in the back row. She ran a natural hair salon 2 blocks away and had come because her accountant retired, and someone in her building had mentioned the free workshop. She watched the way Terence moved through the material. Patient, precise, never making anyone feel small for not knowing something, never treating a basic question like an interruption. She watched the way the room trusted him, the way he made a complicated thing feel manageable without making it feel simple, the way he stayed after the session ended to answer a follow-up question from an older gentleman in the 3rd row who had asked the same question twice and was not embarrassed about it. The story does not follow her home. It doesn't need to. That is not the point of her. The point of her is that this is what Terence Bowman's world looked like now. Quiet, purposeful, populated by people who saw him clearly and valued what they saw. He had not built it as a monument to what he had survived. He had built it because it was the right thing to build. Some people spend their whole lives mistaking stillness for weakness. They look at a quiet man and decide he has nothing because they have never learned that the most dangerous thing in any room is a person who knows everything and has chosen, out of love, out of principle, out of a mercy that ran deeper than anyone around them deserved, to say nothing. The day Dominique filed those papers, she did not just end a marriage. She ended the only reason Terence had left to keep his silence in place. And silence, once it breaks, does not go back. It converts. Now I want to ask you something before you go. If you had been in Terence's position, if you had been sitting on that kind of information for 4 years trying to hold your marriage together, and the person you were protecting walked into a courthouse and filed papers on the same day they passed the bar, what would you have done? Would you have done what Terence did? Would you have done it sooner? Would you have shown more mercy or less? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one, and this community's responses are always worth the read. If this story moved you, hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find their way to stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We have more stories coming. Stories about quiet people who turned out to be anything but powerless. stories about patience that became precision, stories about the moment someone finally decided enough was enough. We will see you in the next one.